the Federal National Mortgage Association and the Federal Home Loan Mortgage Corporation should have these cute little names, but I'm going to go with that usage, even though it's like it's like calling the Kremlin, crummy. Crummy would be okay. It's like calling it by some affectionate name. Makes no sense. Next. Now let me talk about my least favorite economic journalist, Paul Krugman. He wrote a long essay called "How Did Economists Get It So Wrong?" This is a long article he wrote in the New York Times magazine, and I can't tell you how many supposedly sophisticated journalists thought this essay made some sense. It was almost entirely nonsense from start to finish. I'm going to quote a passage from it having to do with the Fed. I quote that passage because it's the only reference to the Fed in the entire article. Macroeconomists are divided in their views. He writes nicely, but the main division is between those who insisted the free market economies never go astray, and those who believe that economies may not stray now and then, but that any major deviations from the path of prosperity could and would be corrected by the all-powerful Fed. Again, it's the same mantra. It was, too much faith in free markets and not enough understanding that free markets go astray. The next and final sentence in the paragraph: neither side was prepared to cope with an economy that went off the rails despite the Fed's best efforts. Now, this is the usual line. Things are usually happening despite the government's best efforts. Government is faulted mainly for not having done enough. It's never part of the problem. It can only be part of the solution. Its error only lies in not being enough of the solution, and that's all we read about the Fed in this entire article. And amazing how we got away with this. How a journalist who's quite well known told me how much he or she, I'll disguise that person's gender, was impressed by the article, even though everybody knew that the Fed and its interest rate policies was clearly, potentially a part of the problem. Krugman didn't even think he had to defend the Fed. He could just toss it off in one phrase, despite the Fed's best efforts. Well, next. Now, I'm putting that as a mainstream view because every once in a while I've written that maybe we're all Austrians now, because those who aren't as benighted and as often a cloud as Krugman is, many mainstream economists have come forward and recognized, lo and behold, that the meltdown, that the Great Recession was not caused by the Keynesian failure of demand. They all know how ridiculous that would sound, given what everybody knew occurred in the marketplace. And so here's Jeffrey Sachs, who's very much a mainstream economist, pretty much summarizing it in broad brushstrokes. The U.S. crisis was actually made by the Fed. Notice how he's saying actually, because he knows how surprising that is. That's sort of old hat to Austrians. The Fed and its interest rate policies and monetary policies are usually at the root of any problem. But okay, it was actually made by the Fed. The Fed pumped money into the U.S. economy and slashed its main interest rate, the federal funds rate, from 3.5% in August 2001 to a mere 1% by mid-2003. The Fed held this rate too low for too long. Monetary expansion generally makes it easier to borrow and lowers the cost of doing so. What was distinctive this time was that the new borrowing was concentrated in housing. All right, that's a mainstream economist I can applaud. He should go with that. He should begin to explore not just this recession, but other recessions. He'll find something similar happen, and he should go with that by asking himself, what are the implications? What do we have to do about it? He's not indicting the free market. He's indicting the Fed, and he's indicting housing. Maybe he understands that the housing sector was also very much warped by the government. Well, let's begin to put flesh on the bones of what Jeffrey Sachs said. Next. Now, there I have a chart. It's called negative interest rates. Now, the first question anybody has to ask himself is, in a free market, would there ever be anybody dumb enough to lend you money at an interest rate below the rate of inflation? Of course not. And certainly, if the average, most of us wouldn't be done enough, even if we're not even in the loan business. Certainly no banker who's in the business would ever do such a thing. That's clearly that's a way to go bankrupt. You lend at 2% and prices are going up by 4%. You at least charge the rate of inflation. Well, the Federal Reserve did what no other bank would ever think of doing. It did it because it's not a free market bank. It's a government-controlled entity that can do what it wants, that can completely abrogate laws of the market. And all I did was calculate briefly what the interest rate on federal funds was on an annual basis as an average against the inflation rate. And you'll notice that if you subtract the inflation rate from the federal funds rate, then for 4 straight years in a row, you get negative interest rates. And you get the first lesson in how not to be a banker in the free market, but how to be a banker in the rigged market of crony capitalism. Next. Now, there I'm showing, and now I'm going to be talking about another reformer, and part of the thread of what I'm going to say is that while I am a radical, I believe that the Federal Reserve should be abolished. I don't mind reform. I ask people, would you have opposed Gorbachev's glasnost on the grounds that it was just lulling the Russians into liking communism more? Well, glasnost made life a little bit better for the Russians. Anything that can make life better for people this afternoon, any radical should support. In 1830, if somebody told me that they wanted reforms to make working conditions easier for slaves, I would have supported that too. I would have said, well, we basically have to abolish slavery. But if this afternoon I can make life easier for them, I'll do it. I'll support that. Because I don't necessarily think that makes it less possible to bring about the radical change I want. It could make it more possible. And indeed, just by the way, just to digress a moment, you couldn't believe how the neoconservatives hated Ronald Reagan because he was appeasing the Russians. They declared he lost the Cold War 12 months before the Berlin Wall came down because he was being too nice to Gorbachev. So, with that spirit, I'm going to support John Taylor, who's a Stanford economist who wants reforms to the Fed. This is his own indictment of Federal Reserve policy. It's called the Taylor Rule. I can explain it briefly, but I won't take your time for the moment. It's a formula fits to inflation and to economic growth, by which the federal funds rate, the interest rate of the federal funds, that is the target rate of the Federal Reserve, should be calculated. And he makes the point that through the 90s, the Taylor Rule was pretty much being respected. Until 2001, late 2001, it was also pretty much being respected. And then the Taylor Rule would have called for much higher interest rates. That's the line you see on the top, when in fact the Federal Reserve knowingly violated the Taylor Rule. This is another, just more abstract way of saying that even according to a fairly mainstream economist, John Taylor, it was clearly doing something a little bit offbeat. By any standard, but more importantly, as I said, it was maintaining negative interest rates, which clearly made no sense. Well, let's get to Alan Greenspan next. This is now Alan Greenspan has gone around preaching what we can call the mea culpa. The mea culpa is, of course, that everybody else screwed up. He certainly didn't. Imagine what the man must be going through. If you had brought about an interest rate policy that imposed misery on millions of people, tens of millions of people, if your sins of commission and omission make Bernie Madoff look like a minor embezzler, then you'd be upset too. Then you might begin to rationalize your own behavior.